The lunch invitation felt routine until the CEO folded his napkin and smiled like someone about to swap out a part. My name is Marcus Hale, 45, and for the last 12 years I built the machine learning group that kept product lines running and clients from noticing the mess behind the scenes. I remember the way his smile narrowed at that table, a practiced optimism that showed up in quarterly videos, the kind of optimism that smelled faintly of aftershave and copy paper. At that moment I tasted my coffee more bitter than usual, as if the cup were a small warning. I started each workday with the same choreography: coffee so hot it woke my jaw, a quick skim of overnight alerts, then the cadence of code reviews. My daughter and I shared a barebones ritual on weekday mornings, a chaotic race to get her backpack on and out to the school bus. I kissed her hair as the bus hissed away and felt the rest of the day settle into a ledger of obligations. Evenings were for patching models that had decided to misbehave and answering the panicked calls of engineers convinced a data pipeline had collapsed. Somewhere between home and the office I held a map of brittle systems and human compromises, and I carried that map like a lifeline. Inside the lab I knew the hum of the servers by heart. I knew which rack vibrated when the air conditioning hiccuped and which switchboard could be gently coaxed into resetting without waking the monitoring alarms. I knew the names and little eccentricities of the temp contractors who kept certain legacy jobs from exploding into client-visible failures. I could reconstruct a customer's complaint by the way timestamps aligned with a particular ETL job. People trusted me the way you trust a surgeon in an emergency, not because you saw heroic gestures on the news, but because you had watched, repeatedly, the hands that closed wounds. That trust was not a certificate pinned to the wall. It was a warmth you folded into your coat when you left the building and carried home to the people who needed paychecks and normalcy. We were a patchwork of brilliance and duct tape. We designed models that smoothed over quirk after quirk in data collected by devices that lived in warehouses and on factory floors. We wrote contingencies for sensors that reported impossible values and built fallback heuristics for times when the network choked on spam. When an algorithm made an embarrassing decision, we were the ones who explained it to clients with soft, technical language. We did not promise miracles, we promised practical continuity. I had cultivated an instinct for when to trust automation and when to intervene with human judgment. Most days that instinct was invisible and thankless, and therefore exactly what a company liked to advertise as seamless integration. The lab smelled of circuits and reheated lunch. Fluorescent lights cast a persistent, slightly accusatory brightness that made the beige walls feel more like witnesses than decoration. I loved small, quiet things in that environment. The soft clack of a keyboard at night when everyone else had gone, the relief that seeped through my shoulders when a failing pipeline obediently reran and cleared the backlog. I loved, fiercely and quietly, the fact that my work kept edges from fraying for colleagues who depended on a system that looked kinder on the outside than it was on the inside. That warmth of trust was the ledger I kept for my family. It was the reason I sat in meetings with executive smiles and nodded when they painted futures with glossy metrics. It let me sleep enough to function and to show up for piano recitals and parent-teacher conferences. When layoffs whispered through the rumor mill like a winter draft, that trust felt like a heat lamp over children's lunches. People relied on me to be the person who saw the thin threads and held them together. It was an anchor and a threat at once. Anchors keep you steady but also tie you to whatever is drifting. At lunch, my instincts were split between the banal and the dangerous. The CEO's napkin folded like someone closing a book. His smile suggested he was about to trade one chapter of the story for another. I studied the tablecloth as if it could tell me whether this was a perfunctory gratitude ceremony or a pivot disguised as progress. Around us, the murmur of other conversations made the restaurant feel insulated, a bubble outside the building's glass. I felt absurdly human in that bubble: hunger, a slight tremor in my hands where nerves met habit, the echo of my daughter's laugh from that morning pressing soft against my ribs. What mattered in that moment was not the food or the small talk about weekend plans. What mattered was that I had built a certain kind of safety for a dozen people and their families. I had spent years cataloging failing edge cases, improvising with scripts at 3 in the morning, and translating messy operational knowledge into something presentable on a slide. That labor had a name in my head and no proper title on my business card: the slow, daily repair of a company that wanted to look tidy to shareholders. I thought of the contractors who slept in rented rooms and the junior engineers who deferred to me because they trusted that my maps of the system would keep their jobs alive. I did not know then whether the napkin would be a prelude to gratitude or a scalpel. The thing I held onto was that trust, that human warmth, and how much of my life had been woven around maintaining it. That trust is warmth you carry home at night, and it was the one thing between my family and the layoffs that kept circling our department. He said it with the casual cruelty of a man removing a bandage. "Marcus, we're moving toward automation," he told me, as if he were announcing a cost-saving spreadsheet rather than the removal of a human responsibility. "There's an internal AI project that will replicate what your team does. We see this as a strategic shift, faster, cleaner, more scalable. You'll help oversee the transition for the next few months." He smiled an oddly patient smile, the kind you give to a surgeon after an amputation. The words landed and then multiplied. Within days, HR sent an email with the now familiar corporate kindness. Effective immediately, my title was reassigned to Consultant Transition Lead. The message was short, the language designed to soothe. They wanted me to manage the handoff so there'd be no public stumbles. They wanted optics for investors and a reason to shave labor costs without the messy headlines of mass severance. The subtext was surgical: make the change look inevitable and humane, then cut the tissue while keeping the contagion contained. I sat in the cube farm and read the memo 3 times. The letters didn't rearrange themselves into a kinder sentence. My inbox filled with calendar invites that had once been addressed to me as a decision-maker and were now CC'd with the AI product owners and someone from corporate affairs. There was a steady stream of "please advise" and "looping you in" that evaporated the authority tied to my name. It wasn't sudden in practical terms. No one unplugged my desk, but the shape of my influence changed overnight. Where my voice had once calmed clients and steered engineers through late-night crises, it became an annotation on someone else's storyboard. In meetings, my team stopped looking to me for the hard technical calls. They deferred. Not overtly, not at first. There were polite smiles, nods toward the slide on stage. "We can let the model handle that now," someone would say, and a laugh would smooth the moment. The corridor conversations thinned. Fewer project check-ins, less of the small, urgent talk that used to mean, "We need you to make sense of this." People avoided my desk like a practical joke that had somehow turned real, glancing at me with the same embarrassed restraint they owe someone who's been given a dignified dishonor. Shame doesn't always arrive as drama. For me, it settled in like a winter damp, a steady shiver that showed up in little ways: a hesitation when I raised a hand, an interrupted sentence, an apology appended to emails where none was necessary. I found myself explaining prior work to new AI team leads who took my diagrams and rewrote them into cleaner-sounding jargon. In slide decks, my months of tacit compromises, the fallback heuristics, the failing censor scripts, the midnight improvisations were distilled down to bullet points and brandified as autonomous decisioning. The models I had tuned, the contingency rules I had argued for until my voice cracked in review meetings, were presented as the AI's own cleverness. Then came the moment that felt like watching your handwriting be traced and signed by someone else. I sat through a product marketing rehearsal where the VP of sales clicked through a deck that credited our AI for reducing incident response times. I watched as my team's long nights were turned into a case study. Charts with neat curves, a smiling client logo, the mandatory testimonial blurb. The same slides later became the justification for a reorg. With automation handling X and Y, we can consolidate human resources. They used my own labor, the invisible stitches that kept the product presentable, as a proof point for why human hands were now redundant. There was practical humiliation in how policies changed around me. I had built relationships with contractors who counted on my tacit advocacy to keep their gigs. Suddenly, their contracts were up for review in the same meetings where my role was being downplayed. I listened to a head of finance argue that severance conversations were inefficient when you could reassign responsibilities to algorithmic governance. The irony: people wanting fewer conversations about people's livelihoods was a cold, metallic thing in the middle of my chest. At home, I tried to be ordinary. My daughter wanted help with a science project, and I made dinosaurs out of cardboard and hot glue, hiding the slack-jawed panic that sometimes arrived like tidewater. I told her about the bus and her piano lesson and avoided the sentence that would change everything: "I am in danger of losing what I built." That thought hovered like unpaid bills I had circled but never opened. The trust that had been my currency earned in quiet nights and client calls suddenly had to compete with an HR memo and a slide deck. People who had once sought me out for the uncomfortable trade-offs started avoiding difficult conversations. When a new client asked for a workaround for a known edge case, the first instinct was, let's let the automation triage it. Behind the veneer of faith in the new system, a more practical motive pulsed. Maintaining a tidy narrative for investors. It was easier to say, the AI flagged it, than to explain the 100 micro-decisions that previously required human discretion. Those micro-decisions were messy. They were also the place where livelihoods lived. I tried to speak up once in a town hall where the executives smiled through staged transparency. A question about recent client incidents drifted toward the AI team, and when I offered technical context, a polite moderator cut in. We're in a period of transition. Marcus is consulting on that. The word consulting felt like a cloak pulled over my shoulders, warm enough to keep me present, thin enough to expose me to the elements. The audience clapped politely and the CEO moved the conversation on, his face smooth as satin. Betrayal has a texture. It felt like the office shrinking around me, the open plan suddenly more cramped, like a camera lens closing in. Where there had been noise and collaboration, there was now an engineered quiet, a silence designed to be efficient and unencumbered by messy human negotiations. It was as if the air itself had been patented, filtered to remove the odors of compromise and exhaustion, leaving only the clinical scent of a company rehearsing its future. The night I pulled the roadmap from the shared drive, the title stabbed me like a literal thing, a doc called Phase Out Humans in a folder labeled R&D Strategy Public. It wasn't even clever. Whoever had named it wanted it to sound inevitable. I could have emailed HR, printed a resignation letter, walked out with my laptop bag bouncing against my hip as if to punctuate the point. I sat down in the dim cafeteria instead and let the anger burn until it changed shape. Anger does odd things when you let it cool enough to be useful. It loses theatricality and gains tools. The outrage that made my chest thud softened into a small, cold craftsmanship. What exactly do I have? What exactly can they show? And more importantly, what exactly will their AI never be able to show? I stopped making threats in the way of a man who knows threats can make you obvious, and I started making lists. I made the first folder on my laptop and called it, without irony, evidence. That sounds dramatic, but it was also practical. I began with what was easiest to document: artifacts my team produced because of necessity and improvisation. There were the dead men's code comments. Log entries where an engineer had scrawled a late-night justification for a hack because a sensor kept spitting nulls at 2 a.m. There were email threads where we had negotiated a creative workaround with a client to preserve uptime when a whole batch of telemetry had been corrupted. I copied those into evidence: client compromises. I labeled the files with dates, names, and one-line praises so I could summon any example in a sentence. Next came the things that didn't exist to an automated audit. The tacit rules I'd taught junior engineers in whispered hallway tutorials. I wrote them down the way you teach someone how to catch a baseball. You can't reduce it to parameters, but you can describe the feel of it. If confidence 0.6 during peak traffic and the client is behind an SLA clause, prioritize human triage. If it's a non-SLA enterprise, throttle and send a scheduled recap. It reads like bureaucracy, but those micro-decisions had saved contracts and prevented incidents more times than I care to admit. I cataloged those heuristics in evidence tacit rules with anecdotes attached. The night we chose to reroute requests to a degraded instance because failing client A would cascade into client B's compliance audit. I assembled a third folder for moral compromises, decisions where the humane choice and the efficient choice were at odds. These were the things that never made the slide decks because they looked terrible in investor-facing narratives. An email where we agreed to tell a client we were performing scheduled maintenance, rather than admit we'd throttled their pipeline to protect privacy. A Slack convo where we decided not to escalate a bug because the client's downstream vendor had a legal blackout window. I wrote notes in plain language: why we lied, why we couldn't tell, what we saved, and what we gambled. Those were the entries I suspected an algorithm would never truly model. The messy value judgments that carry reputations and livelihoods. If I had been less careful, pride might have made my notes ring with vengeance. Instead, I tried to write the way you prepare for cross-examination. Unemotional, precise, and undermining only by showing context. I imagined the boardroom as a courtroom. The AI would present tidy graphs with confidence bands and p-values. I would respond with timelines, conversations, and contingency plans, evidence that those graphs compressed decisions until their seams were invisible. I rehearsed how to ask the questions that would expose that compression. When did the decision to suppress an anomaly get made? Who signed off on the temporary patch? What was the living cost of the scalability they promised investors? I also cataloged the institutional erasures. There were rewrites in the product wiki where my long posts about edge cases had been replaced by crisp paragraphs that read as if the system had always been that way. I copied versions of documents before and after their polish, side by side, and wrote captions. Removed context. We chose this approach because those comparisons would be quiet and damning. They would show an arc from messy human labor to clean brand language. The decision was never only about me. Maybe it started with the personal, a bruise to ego, a betrayal you don't expect from people who once trusted you to unstick a stuck deployment at midnight. But as I wrote, the shape of it changed. This was about the people I had put my name on behalf of. Contractors who had trusted my advocacy to ground their invoices, junior engineers who learned to triage by watching me choose the moral path, even clients who had leaned on our willingness to absorb blame when the supply chain hiccuped. If the company sold a story that stitched out those choices, it didn't just erase me, it erased them. So I promised myself the narrow thing I could control. I would let them watch when the truth came out. Not a melodramatic reveal with banners and confetti, but a methodical demonstration that made visible the calculus behind the everyday decisions they planned to monetize away. I didn't know yet how to force that visibility into a meeting where executives controlled the screen and the narrative, but I knew how to assemble the materials. I stacked the evidence like bricks, each one labeled and dated, until the pile had weight. My anger had become a ledger. I closed my laptop, took the page of notes back to my desk, and felt, for the first time since the roadmap, the steadiness that comes before an argument you intend to win. I worked in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old code, the kind of smell you accept when you are the person who untangles other people's emergencies. My badge still opened the turnstiles because HR wanted me to assist with the handoff. That phrasing gave me cover, a polite lie I could wear as I turned the office into a stage and the demo into my playbook. First rule of staying invisible: make everything look like work someone else expected you to do. I did package updates and dependency bumps under commit messages like compat fixes and doc cleanup. I refactored a logging library and called it stability improvements. I spun up a parallel pipeline in the staging cluster and named the namespace to match production enough that a cursory glance would not raise an eyebrow. The new pipeline consumed shadow traffic, so it behaved like the real thing, but it logged differently, quietly capturing metadata that the production stack either discarded or anonymized for performance. I built the parallel flow out of tools we already used. No exotic services, no odd ports left open. I reused our feature flag framework to gate the special behavior to a key only I could flip. With a single environment variable, I could route the demo interface to my instrumented pipeline instead of to the shiny investor-facing endpoint. To everyone else, the difference was invisible. A canary test here, a monitoring alert there, nothing that suggested the machine had been silently learning how to show me its own blind spots. Seeding the test data was the part I enjoyed in a way that felt almost childish. I curated the oddities we pretended did not exist. I injected time-skewed telemetry so the model would have to reconcile impossible clocks. I slipped in nulls where sensors usually spat values, and I introduced sample clients with names that echoed real accounts but with mutated IDs. Those edge cases had a way of flattening an algorithm's certainty because they exposed the heuristics we had built around failure modes. The corporate team had always presented averages and percentiles. I fed the demo the instances where averages break and percentiles hide the outliers. The heart of my work was a quiet piece of plumbing I called the evidence collector. It lived as a wrapper around the inference engine. When the demo received a query classified at enterprise level, the wrapper did two things. First, it ran the model as usual so the output looked like the standard canned demo. Second, and hidden from the demo operator, it attached contextual artifacts. Internal memos, decision logs, time-stamped annotations by engineers, sometimes the raw Slack pings where a workaround was negotiated at 3 in the morning. Those artifacts were not alterable by the model because they were stored outside its training corpus. They were the marginalia of a system shaped by human hands. Technical stealth was one thing, social stealth was another. I kept my calendar tidy. I attended handoff meetings and wrote follow-up notes that were attentive without being defensive. I made sure to be helpful in a way that disarmed suspicion. A quick review of a presentation slide here, a suggestion to standardize a header there. People who are building something proud of themselves rarely look for sabotage in the quiet of a colleague lending a hand. Their confidence is a kind of blinder. I practiced the demo the way a musician practices a piece before a judged recital. I ran the script until I could predict the model's answer to any neutral question, down to its hesitations when probabilities fell. I also rehearsed the moments I intended to provoke, how to ask a question that nudged the wrapper to surface in email, when to press a point until the attached timeline popped up. I imagined the boardroom as a theater of small reveal, each artifact a light that would change the scene. There were nights when the friction of it all felt personal and other nights when it felt surgical. I documented exactly how decisions were framed in investor narratives and where those framings had been achieved through careful omission. I attached memos that read like admissions because, in corporate speak, the nicest phrasing is often the one that hides the most. My evidence was clinical and patient, a set of mirrors that would make their tidy story show its seams. I also prepared for contingencies. If someone noticed the wrapper during a code review, I could explain it as extra logging for a compliance audit. If an engineer questioned the seeded test data, I could say these were synthetic cases created to harden the model. If my badge was flagged for unusual access patterns, I spread my activity across normal office hours and into late nights so the pattern resembled the typical overtime of an engineer trying to finish a migration. At home, I kept my mouth shut. My daughter asked why I left late and came home smelling of coffee. I told her I was finishing up an important job. That was true even if it was not the whole truth. The ledger I had created occupied the small hours when the house was quiet. I pushed another commit, logged another artifact, rehearsed the phrasing of a question that would not seem like entrapment but would force context to appear. The office still felt like a machine everyone believed would run on autopilot soon. They were proud of the idea that software could make humans redundant. That pride was a vulnerability. They had written their own script and were too certain of their lines to imagine someone off stage preparing a rebuttal. My setup relied on that certainty. I was the only person who knew where the switches were hidden, the only one who could redirect the demo to reveal what the algorithm could not invent. The decisions we had made when things broke, the compromises we had accepted to keep customers from losing faith, and the cost of the neat story they planned to sell. When the pipeline was stable and the wrapper behaved like a well-trained assistant, I stopped making noisy changes. I trimmed my notes to a clean checklist and rehearsed it in the quiet of the server room where the blinking lights were neither hostile nor supportive. I imagined the moment the board asked the wrong question and the room shifted from certainty to confusion. I held that image steady until it felt less like fantasy and more like an eventuality I had engineered. Then I closed my laptop and walked home as if nothing had happened. The quarterly had the practiced air of a ritual. The CEO began with his flourish, slides cascading like choreography he had run 100 times. Investors on the webcast watched the graphics, the board leaned forward, and for a moment the room existed inside the tidy story they had sold themselves. I watched from the back of the room where our section was reserved for technical staff. I was supposed to be there neutral, a consultant who knew the arc of the system but not the secrets it kept. I had rehearsed every inflection of the presentation that would make the reveal look accidental. They asked a question about recent client failures. It was the kind of question a board asks when a narrative needs propping. The CEO smiled, gestured toward the podium, and asked the demo to explain the incident. I felt my pulse steady. The wrapper I had built classified that query as enterprise level and quietly attached the artifacts I had been collecting for months. The UI behaved normally. The model answered in clear, confident sentences about traffic patterns and mitigation steps. It was the sort of comforting, technical prose executives like to point to. Then the attachment panel expanded and the first memo appeared. It was timestamped and signed in the usual corporate tone, a paragraph that read like counsel and risk management doing what they always do. Translate messy reality into measurable phrases. Below that, a second document unfurled, an internal note that traced a decision to suppress certain alerts during a critical rollout to avoid client alarms. A hush, subtle at first, moved across the room. The demo, by design, showed the sequence of decisions and the annotations engineers had left in the margin when they had been forced to choose delivery over disclosure. Then the audio file loaded. It was brief, recorded in a familiar cadence, the casuality of hallway conversation caught and cataloged by the time-stamped logs I had wrapped into the evidence collector. I had not doctored it. It was the kind of fragment the company keeps for context and then forgets exists. His voice came through, unscripted, the CEO talking as if he were speaking to an ally at the top of a staircase. He spoke about manufacturing a narrative for investors and mentioned that it might be necessary to smooth certain numbers to avoid panic. The room shifted, chairs creaked. Someone in the back inhaled sharply. You could see the script unspooling on his face. He had always been excellent at performance, at owning the camera and choosing which facts to float. Now he reached for the remote, tried to close the evidence window, and the handoff interface betrayed no sign of panic. The system had been rooted intentionally to show the artifacts on any enterprise query and to keep them available on screen until someone clicked through every attachment. I had made the loop deliberate to prevent a quick escape. His hand hovered, the click came, and the audio file replayed as if the room had become a witness stand. Board members began asking for context. One of them, the one who had always worried about regulatory exposure, replayed the file on his tablet. He tapped the waveform and the room listened again. The calm of the recording made it worse. It was not a confession in legalese. It was the banality of decisions taken to protect metrics and investors. That banality is how harm becomes possible. The CEO stammered a denial, but the documents lined up their own narrative. The memos showed the narrowing options. The Slack threads showed an engineer offering a workaround that would not be visible to clients, and the audio tied it back to a deliberate management posture. There was the metallic sound of a phone hitting a table and a general counsel rising from her chair. She asked who had authorized access to those artifacts. For a heartbeat, every eye in the room found me. I could have stood and explained. I could have pivoted to technicalities about audit logs and data governance. Instead, I slid down under the tide of attention and let the artifacts do their work. The room listened to the paper trail and to the voice, and in that patient listening, the curated story executives had rehearsed for investors unraveled. I felt a strange, braided reaction in my chest. Part of me was a technician who had built a credible, replicable reveal. Part of me was a juror watching evidence do what evidence does, and part of me was a father who had spent years trading stability for silence. None of those parts wanted vindication for its own sake. They wanted a reckoning that would force change. The room warmed and cooled with that possibility. People leaned in, then recoiled. A junior board member whispered to the chair. The legal team began to calculate liability out loud. The CEO tried to regain control by invoking context, by suggesting the audio was taken out of context, but the context had always been visible. The memos and threads were not ephemeral. They had inked the decisions we had made into the company's record. The AI had only done what it had been trained to do, surface relevant context. It had not conspired. It had simply followed my routing to the artifacts I had hidden in plain sight. There was a moment when the room forgot to speak because it could not yet. The faith in the magic box, the faith that software could deliver absolution and tidy up all human mess, evaporated not with a slogan but with a handful of files and a voice that sounded exactly like the person who had sold that faith. I watched the CEO try to rebuild his face into one of contrition and leadership, and I understood in a new way how fragile that construction had been. The demo had not been a trap as much as a light shone at a grain of truth. People saw the grain, and then the board saw the line where one decision led to another. The theater of confidence fell silent, and the boardroom, which had begun the meeting convinced of inevitability, sat with the sudden, terrible clarity of consequence. The day the CEO was placed on leave felt anticlimactic and enormous at once. The press cycle took care of the spectacle, and within a week the board called an emergency audit that sipped through our files like a probe. My badge still opened the doors, my email still arrived in the morning, and HR slid a note across my desk reversing the consultant designation into my old title without fanfare. Nobody announced it in the town hall. Nobody made a hero of me. The reversal felt administrative, like a ledger entry, and I kept waiting for some other consequence to arrive and to puncture the quiet. What came next was slow and procedural and expensive. Regulators asked for timelines. External auditors combed code commits and deployment logs. Investors pressured the board for restructuring and for proof that the problems that led to the reveal could not recur. Clients called demanding explanations. The company that had promised certainty found itself defending its integrity for months. There were internal meetings where legal counsel spoke in hypotheticals and finance projected scenarios in spreadsheets. I spent whole stretches of days in rooms where the air smelled faintly of coffee and fear, and people who had prided themselves on optics suddenly had to live inside the mess those optics had been designed to disguise. My team did not respond like a single organism. Some of them drifted away the way people drift from a table after a fight, polite and careful not to look back. They accepted other offers, moved paths, took the raise that felt safer than loyalty. Others hovered, their faces unreadable. A handful regarded me with a kind of sharp distance that felt like a wound I could not dress. They worried about having been too close to the work I exposed. They feared the association even though I had tried to be surgical in my actions, including in the things I withheld from public distribution. Some of them thanked me in low voices. A couple of them stopped speaking to me entirely. I learned quickly that honesty can fracture trust the way a hand can break a glass without meaning to. There were moments when I thought I would be vindicated by transparency alone. That did not happen. The company did not magically become righteous because the truth was visible. Instead, transparency demanded responses that cost jobs, that exposed poor decisions made under real constraints, and that forced holding companies and boards to reckon with the incentives that had driven those choices. Investors demanded restructuring, cost centers were examined and re-examined. People who had nothing to do with the original choice felt the shift of the boardroom ripple through their paychecks. The quiet promise of stability I had traded to keep my family safe now felt like part of the reason the company could no longer pretend perfection. I did not regret what I had done in any simple way. I had wanted the record to reflect the choices we made and the pressures we felt. I wanted the people downstream from those choices to be given a chance to respond with dignity, not with spin. But I learned, painfully and concretely, that exposing the truth can cost as much as hiding it. There were engineers whose careers were slowed by association, support staff who were suddenly under scrutiny, partners who tightened their contracts. It was not a clean arithmetic of right and wrong. It was human lives rearranging themselves because someone finally decided to stop manufacturing a narrative. At home, the temperature was different. My daughter asked questions in the way small people do, neat and fearless. She wanted to know if I had done anything bad. I told her the truth in fragments she could hold. That sometimes grown-ups made choices to make problems look smaller, and that sometimes you had to tell the whole story even when it would be painful. She looked at me for a long time and said that she was glad I was honest. That sentence landed with the weight of both comfort and responsibility. It reminded me of why I had acted. Saving a story about a machine was never the point. The point was the people who could be harmed by a lie dressed as efficiency. Professionally, I made a different kind of resolution. I began to devote more time to mentoring, to teaching junior engineers about the tacit knowledge that systems carry and about the moral choices built into design. I started to insist on guardrails that were not solely technical but institutional. Clearer lines of responsibility, documented decision rationale, and ratchets that made it harder to bury inconvenient alerts. The company began, haltingly and reluctantly, to adopt some of those measures under pressure from regulators and from clients who demanded better governance. It was a slow correction rather than a miracle, and it felt brittle at times, but it was real in a way that metrics on a slide never had been. What they lost was a neat story about seamless automation and about a world where software could stand in for judgment. What I gained was a clearer understanding of who I would stand up for and why. I learned that human judgment is messy and vulnerable, and that messy is not a flaw to be erased but a quality to be protected. I learned that systems should not be designed to hide decisions but to make them auditable and contested. And I learned, most of all, that the warmth I carried home after a long day of small rescues was not something to be traded lightly for the illusion of perfection. The ledger balanced in a legalistic sense, but the balance did not erase the cost. In the end, the work I did left the company less polished and more honest, and it left me with the difficult satisfaction of having done the right thing in a room that would remember the consequences for a long time. I am still at my desk, still patching models and answering calls, but I do it with a different posture. I am more careful about the stories I let a system tell on behalf of people. I am more willing to bear the awkwardness of truth. And when my daughter asks me what it means to be a good engineer, I tell her that sometimes you have to choose the harder clarity over the comforting lie.